They told him to wait, but what happened next shook the entire courtroom to its core. Injustice often hides in plain sight, buried beneath procedures and quiet dismissals. Darrell Carter thought he knew how the system worked, until he found himself on the wrong side of it. What started as a routine hearing quickly unraveled into something much bigger, exposing a truth too many have faced but too few have challenged. They let everyone else in but told him to wait. What happened next left the entire courthouse in shock. The courthouse was already alive with movement by the time Darrell Carter stepped through the heavy glass doors. Monday mornings at Jefferson County Courthouse were always a mess. Lawyers rushing in and out, court clerks stacking papers, and the faint hum of whispered conversations bouncing off the marble walls. The scent of old books and burnt coffee lingered in the air, mixing with the occasional burst of perfume from an overworked paralegal darting by. Darrell had been here before, not as a defendant, not as a plaintiff, but as a businessman caught in an endless legal battle over a contract dispute that should have been resolved months ago. He was prepared, dressed in a tailored gray suit, navy blue tie perfectly knotted, and his brown leather briefcase tucked under his arm. This wasn't his first legal rodeo, and he knew how the system worked, or at least he thought he did. The line at the check-in desk moved fast. One by one, people stepped forward, handed over their paperwork, received a nod, and were waved through the double doors leading to their assigned courtrooms. Some left with smiles, others with tight jaws and hurried steps, their fates hanging in the balance of whatever judge they were about to face. Darrell reached the desk, offering his paperwork to a bored-looking court officer who barely glanced at him before flipping through the pages. "Carter, Darrell," Darrell said, keeping his tone even. The officer, a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s with graying hair and tired eyes, scanned the papers before looking up at him, really looking. There was a moment of hesitation, a pause too long to be normal. Darrell had seen it before, though he never liked to acknowledge it. The officer cleared his throat. "You'll have to wait outside." Darrell blinked. "Outside?" The man barely reacted. "Yeah, over there by the benches." Darrell turned, following the direction of the man's lazy wave toward a row of metal benches lined up against the far wall. A handful of people sat there, most of them shifting in their seats, bouncing knees, checking phones, the kind of people still waiting for their names to be called, for their cases to be decided. He glanced back at the officer. "I was told my hearing starts at 9 sharp. Everyone else is going in." The officer didn't even bother looking at him this time. "They'll call you when they're ready." Something about the way he said it, flat and final, left no room for argument. Darrell hesitated. His instinct told him to push back, demand to know why he was being singled out. But he had been in enough rooms like this to know how things worked. The wrong reaction could turn a minor inconvenience into something worse. So instead, he gave a small nod, took his paperwork, and turned toward the benches. As he walked, he noticed a pattern. People who looked like him were waiting. People who didn't walked right through those doors. But this was just the beginning. Darrell sat on the cold metal bench, his fingers tapping lightly against his briefcase. He checked his watch. 8:47 a.m. Still early. Maybe this was just standard procedure, nothing more than an administrative shuffle. But as the minutes ticked by, it became harder to ignore what was happening right in front of him. A middle-aged white man in a navy blue polo and khakis walked up to the same check-in desk, holding a thick manila folder. The same officer barely looked at his paperwork before gesturing him through the courtroom doors. The entire interaction lasted 15 seconds. A young blonde woman, no older than 25, in a beige pencil skirt and white blouse stepped up next. The officer greeted her with an easy smile, scanned her documents, and sent her through. 10 seconds. Darrell swallowed hard, shifting in his seat. His fingers tightened around the edge of his briefcase. Maybe there was a reason. Maybe his paperwork needed extra processing. Maybe, "Excuse me, sir, have they called your name yet?" Darrell turned. A man in a brown suit with graying temples sat 2 seats down, watching him. Looked like he had spent his entire life in courtrooms. Creased forehead, deep lines around his mouth, a gaze that had seen more hearings than it cared to count. Darrell shook his head.
"No."
"I was told to wait out here." The man hummed, tapping a finger on the armrest. "What's your case?" "Business dispute," Darrell said, keeping it short. The man nodded as if he already knew. "I had a feeling." Darrell frowned. "What do you mean?" Before the man could answer, another person approached the check-in desk. A black woman in a red blazer holding a small folder. The officer barely looked at her before muttering something under his breath and jerking his head toward the benches. Same wave of the hand, same dismissal. Darrell's stomach tightened. The woman sighed and walked over, sitting on the far end of the bench. She pulled out her phone, scrolling mindlessly, but the set of her jaw said she knew exactly what was happening. Another 10 minutes passed, then 20. Darrell watched as more people arrived. Some checked in and were sent straight through, barely stopping long enough to exchange words. Others, mostly black, a few Latino, were told to wait. His pulse throbbed against his temple. This wasn't coincidence. At exactly 9:15 a.m., a balding white man in an expensive charcoal suit rushed in, muttering about being late. He barely broke his stride as he waved a folder at the officer. "Courtroom B, right?" he said. The officer gave a nod, lifting the rope for him. "Go on in, Mr. Hayes." Darrell shot up from his seat. "Excuse me." His voice was controlled but firm. The officer glanced at him, irritated. "What about me?" Darrell asked, holding up his paperwork. "I've been waiting for almost 45 minutes. The officer didn't even bother hiding his annoyance. He exhaled loudly, flipping through a pile of documents on the desk. Then, without looking up, he repeated, "You'll be called when they're ready." Darrell's patience snapped. "You just let that man through without even checking his name." The officer's eyes finally met his. There was something in them, something smug, something dismissive. "You need to calm down, sir." Darrell's jaw tensed. The words weren't just instructions. They were a warning. The courthouse air felt heavier, suffocating. He could feel eyes on him. Some people watching with quiet curiosity, others pretending not to notice. And then, just as the tension thickened, the double doors at the end of the hall swung open. A woman in a black robe stepped through, her sharp gaze scanning the room. She looked directly at Darrell. "What are you still doing out here?" The judge's voice cut through the courthouse like a blade. Conversations hushed. Even the court officer, who had been so dismissive just moments ago, froze. Stiffened ever so slightly, Darrell turned toward her. He recognized her. Judge Lorraine Whittaker, a no-nonsense woman with a reputation for keeping a tight courtroom. She wasn't the kind of judge you wanted to irritate, but she also wasn't the kind to tolerate nonsense. She was watching him, waiting for an answer. Darrell cleared his throat. "I was told to wait out here, Your Honor." Her brows pulled together. "By who?" Every set of eyes in the hallway shifted to the court officer. He hesitated, then quickly flipped through his stack of papers, pretending to be busy. Judge Whittaker wasn't buying it. "Officer Sanders, is there a reason this gentleman hasn't been allowed inside?" Saunders looked up, trying to appear unbothered. His paperwork must not have been processed yet. Judge Whittaker extended a hand. Give it to me. The shift in the atmosphere was immediate. There was no way for him to refuse without making things worse. So with forced casualness, Sanders grabbed Darrell's folder and handed it over. The judge flipped through the pages, her expression unreadable. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. Then her lips pressed into a thin line. She lifted her gaze, pinning Sanders with a look so sharp it could cut glass. This has been stamped and cleared for over an hour. Why hasn't he been sent in? The silence was suffocating. Darrell felt his pulse hammering against his skin. Sanders adjusted his belt, forcing a chuckle. Must have been an oversight, Your Honor. An oversight? Darrell clenched his jaw. Every fiber of his being told him to speak up, to call this out for what it was, but the wrong move could flip the entire situation against him. He had seen it happen before. Judge Whittaker exhaled slowly, glancing around. A few attorneys had poked their heads out from the courtroom, sensing the tension. The other people waiting on the benches, some who had clearly been singled out just like Darrell, were watching closely. She turned back to Sanders. An oversight? Sanders nodded quickly. Yes, ma'am. The judge closed the folder, tapping the edge against her palm. Then she spoke, but not to Sanders. Mr. Carter, come with me. Darrell didn't hesitate. He grabbed his briefcase and followed her through the double doors, feeling the weight of every stare on his back. But just as he stepped inside, he heard a voice from behind him. This isn't over. He didn't have to turn around to know who said it, and he knew without a doubt that whatever was coming next would change everything. The moment Darrell stepped inside the courtroom, the contrast hit him like a brick wall. Unlike the tense, controlled chaos of the hallway, this room was orderly, structured. Power was in the air, thick and unmistakable. Rows of polished wooden benches lined the space, attorneys whispering in hushed tones, while clerks scurried between desks. A bailiff stood at attention near the judge's bench, hands folded in front of him like a statue. But all of that faded into the background as Judge Whittaker strode toward her seat with a purpose that made the entire room straighten in their chairs. Darrell followed her lead, feeling the weight of the courtroom's eyes shift onto him. He knew what they were thinking. Who is this man, and why is the judge personally bringing him in? Whittaker settled into her chair, adjusting the microphone in front of her before leveling her gaze at the courtroom officer standing stiffly near the door. Bailiff, please call the next case. The bailiff nodded, flipping open a file. Case number 24 to 178. Carter versus Reynard Holdings. Darrell exhaled slowly, adjusting his tie. Finally, he stepped forward, placing his briefcase on the plaintiff's table. His attorney, a sharp-dressed man in his early 50s, leaned over. Everything good? Darrell forced a smile. Let's just get this over with. The opposing side, the Reynard Holdings legal team, shuffled into their seats, dressed in matching gray suits, looking as if they had been pulled straight from the pages of a corporate magazine. Their lead counsel, William Crestwell, sat back in his chair, lips curled in a smirk. Darrell had seen that smirk before. It was the same expression men like Crestwell always wore. A quiet, patronizing confidence, the look of someone who believed the system was already on their side. But just as the proceedings were about to begin, Judge Whittaker raised a hand. The entire room stilled. Before we begin, I need to address something. Darrell stiffened. He knew exactly where this was going. Whittaker leaned forward slightly, resting her hands on the desk. Mr. Carter, it has come to my attention that you were made to wait outside for an extended period of time, despite your case being scheduled at 9 a.m. Is that correct? Darrell hesitated for only a second. "Yes, Your Honor." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. A few attorneys glanced at each other, confused. Even Crestwell's smirk faltered slightly. Whittaker turned to the bailiff. "Officer Sanders was responsible for check-ins this morning, correct?" The bailiff nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Whittaker exhaled, nodding slowly. Then she turned her sharp gaze toward the courtroom doors. "Officer Sanders, step inside." The room fell into absolute silence. A few seconds later, the doors creaked open, and Sanders walked in, his stiff posture betraying the nerves he was trying to hide. Whittaker gestured toward the empty witness stand. "Take a seat." Darrell felt his pulse quicken. This was not how courtroom proceedings usually went. Sanders hesitated for a moment, then moved toward the stand, sitting with the stiffness of someone who sensed they had made a mistake but still believed they could talk their way out of it. Whittaker laced her fingers together. "Tell me, Officer Sanders, why was Mr. Carter told to wait outside?" Sanders cleared his throat, shifting slightly in his seat. "It was a mistake, Your Honor, an oversight. With all the cases coming through, sometimes things get mixed up." Whittaker didn't blink. "That's interesting." She tapped a pen against her desk, her expression unreadable. "Because I personally checked his file. It was cleared and stamped for court before he even arrived." More whispers filled the room. The Reynard Holdings attorneys shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Whittaker's voice hardened. "I'll ask again. Why was he made to wait?" Sanders opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time since this started, he looked unsure. And that's when Darrell realized something. The courtroom wasn't just watching Sanders. They were waiting for an answer. Waiting to see if he would say what they all suspected. Whittaker let the silence hang before finally speaking. "I suggest you choose your words carefully." The tension in the room was so thick it could have crushed steel. And then Sanders finally said something that made the entire courtroom hold its breath. Officer Sanders swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he glanced around the room. He could feel it now, the weight of every pair of eyes on him. The courtroom wasn't just watching. They were waiting. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, in a low voice, he muttered, "It wasn't personal." Judge Whittaker's expression didn't change. "Explain." Sanders shifted in his seat, suddenly looking much smaller than he had just minutes ago. "I was just following protocol." A scoff echoed from somewhere in the gallery. Darrell, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke. "What protocol?" His voice was steady, but the frustration was clear beneath the surface. Sanders exhaled sharply, his fingers twitching against the wood of the witness stand. "We're told to be cautious with certain cases." "Certain cases?" The room reacted instantly. Low murmurs, a few heads shaking, a collective shift of energy as people pieced together what he was really saying. Judge Whittaker's voice was like steel. "Cautious in what way, Officer Sanders?" Sanders paused, eyes darting toward the Reynard Holdings attorneys. It was barely a flicker, but Darrell caught it. The connection was obvious now. Whittaker noticed too. She leaned forward slightly, elbows on her desk. "Are you saying that a decision was made to delay Mr. Carter's hearing based on instructions you received?" Sanders hesitated. And then, under the pressure of that unrelenting silence, he cracked. "I was told to slow things down, to hold certain people back." His voice barely carried over the room, but the words hit like a punch. The murmurs turned into outright gasps. Judge Whittaker's jaw tightened. "Told by who?" Sanders exhaled through his nose, his face flushing red. "One of the attorneys on the Reynard Holdings team." They said it would be better if Mr. Carter's case was delayed a bit. Darrell felt his chest tighten. He turned his head slowly toward the opposing table, where William Crestwell sat frozen, his smirk completely wiped from his face. Judge Whittaker shifted her attention, her sharp gaze cutting through the air like a blade. Mr. Crestwell. For the first time that morning, the polished attorney lost his composure. He sat forward, palms flat on the table, forcing out a laugh that sounded too tight, too unnatural. Your Honor, I have no idea what this man is talking about. Darrell stared at him, his mind racing. He knew Crestwell was lying. Every inch of his body language screamed it. Judge Whittaker let the moment drag. Then she exhaled, turning back to Sanders. Officer Sanders, you are under oath. I will ask one last time. Did Mr. Crestwell or anyone from his firm instruct you to delay Mr. Carter's check-in? The room was silent. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Sanders nodded. Yes. The reaction was instant. Gasps, a few attorneys whispering furiously, a woman in the gallery covering her mouth. The tension had finally snapped, and now the consequences were barreling toward them at full speed. Judge Whittaker leaned back in her chair, tapping a finger against her desk. The air had shifted completely. She turned to the court clerk. Make a note in the record. I will be addressing this misconduct in full after these proceedings. Crestwell looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. The other attorneys from Reynard Holdings shifted uncomfortably, realizing this case had taken a turn they were not prepared for. Darrell sat still, his pulse still pounding. But now it was different. For the first time since he walked into that courthouse, the power had shifted. And as Judge Whittaker prepared to move forward with the case, everyone in that room knew this was far from over. For the first time since the hearing began, William Crestwell didn't have a word to say. The courtroom was still buzzing from Officer Sanders' confession, whispers bouncing off the walls like a low wave of static. Even the judge let the tension sit for a moment, allowing the weight of what had just been revealed to settle in. Darrell sat with his hands clasped together, his mind replaying every moment leading up to this. The waiting, the dismissiveness, the smirks, the whispered conversations that weren't meant for him to hear. It wasn't paranoia. It was never just in his head. Judge Whittaker finally cleared her throat, snapping the room back into focus. We will proceed with the case as scheduled. However, I want it noted that this court does not tolerate misconduct, especially when it comes to obstructing justice. Crestwell sat up straighter, his confidence returning just enough to force a scoff. Your Honor, I hardly think a minor delay qualifies as obstructing justice. Whittaker didn't even blink. A delay that was deliberately orchestrated in an attempt to gain an advantage in court? That is absolutely obstruction, Mr. Crestwell. A few attorneys in the gallery exchanged glances. They knew what was coming next. The judge leaned back slightly, tapping her fingers against the desk. Before we move forward, I have one more question for Officer Sanders. Sanders looked like he wanted to be anywhere but in that chair. Whittaker turned to him. How many times have you followed instructions like this before? The courtroom fell completely silent. A bead of sweat formed at Sanders' temple. He hesitated. That was all the answer anyone needed. Whittaker's lips pressed into a thin line before she nodded. Bailiff, escort Officer Sanders out. He will be placed on immediate leave pending an internal investigation. The room shifted. This was bigger than anyone had expected. Sanders didn't argue. He simply stood, eyes fixed forward as the bailiff led him out. The sound of the heavy doors closing behind them carried a finality that sent shivers through the crowd. But Judge Whittaker wasn't done. She turned to Crestwell and his team. "And as for you, Mr. Crestwell, I will be filing a formal complaint with the State Bar for legal misconduct. Deliberately interfering with court proceedings is unacceptable, and you will answer for it." Crestwell's smirk was gone now. His co-counsel shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some already scribbling frantic notes as if trying to figure out how to spin this into something salvageable. But there was no fixing this. Not today. Darrell exhaled. For the first time that morning, the weight in his chest felt just a little lighter. Justice wasn't just being spoken, it was being carried out in real time. And as the hearing finally proceeded, he knew this was a moment no one in that courtroom would forget. By the time Darrell stepped out of the courtroom, the world outside felt different. The same gray walls, the same cold tile floors, but the weight that had been pressing against his chest all morning had shifted. He adjusted his tie, inhaling deeply. It was over. At least this part was. Crestwell had stormed out of the courtroom, his usual air of arrogance replaced with a stiff, forced composure. The reality of what had just happened was settling in for him too. The formal complaint from Judge Whittaker wouldn't just be a slap on the wrist. This was the kind of stain that followed a lawyer's career forever. And Officer Sanders. He had walked out with his head low, escorted by the bailiff, knowing full well that his days of unchecked power were numbered. Darrell should have felt triumphant. He should have felt satisfied. But instead he felt tired. Because this wasn't new. He had spent years navigating these moments. Subtle, quiet injustices, the ones that weren't loud enough to make headlines but were sharp enough to cut deep. The ones that made you second-guess yourself, made you wonder if pushing back was worth the risk. Today he had won. But how many others had been silenced before they even got the chance to fight? A familiar voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Carter." Darrell turned. Judge Whittaker was standing near the doors, arms crossed, watching him. For the first time that day, she wasn't in full courtroom mode. She just looked human, tired like him. She exhaled. "I meant what I said in there. I won't let this go." Darrell nodded. "I know." She studied him for a moment longer before giving a small nod. Then, with a final glance toward the now empty courtroom, she walked away. Darrell lingered in the hallway for a moment, staring at the same check-in desk where the morning had begun. How many times had people been told to wait outside without questioning it? How many times had they been ignored long enough to give up? Not today. He tightened his grip on his briefcase and walked toward the exit. Because today, the system had been forced to answer for itself. And maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't forget. Some victories aren't just personal, they set a precedent. Darrell's fight wasn't just about a case. It was about forcing a system to answer for its own failures. Because justice isn't just about winning. It's about making sure no one else has to fight the same battle alone.